events tonight, so thank you for coming to this one. I'm Tyler Grunendahl. I am the president of Praxis. It is my pleasure to introduce to you today Mrs. Shikaha Dalmia. Shikaha Dalmia is a senior analyst at Reason Foundation, a nonprofit think tank advancing free minds and free markets. Dalmia is also a Bloomberg View contributor, a columnist at The Week, and writes regularly for Reason magazine. She also writes frequently for the Wall Street Journal and numerous other publications such as Times of London, Time, USA Today, and The Daily Beast. She's previously served as a columnist for Forbes and the Washington Examiner. Please join me in welcoming Mrs. Shikaha Dalmia.
Thank you, Tyler. Thanks for coming. So the title of my talk is there a case for open borders? And it's a provocative title, I admit. And to most people, the whole notion of open borders just seems crazy and scary. I mean, nations have borders, and sovereign nations have a right to control them, and what could be more obvious than that? Which is all true, but here's the thing. Just because nations have sovereignty over their borders doesn't mean that the tightest possible border controls are the only proper exercise of that sovereignty. A nation doesn't become more sovereign by turning itself into a fortress. If that were the case, North Korea would be the most sovereign nation on the planet because it's the most fortress-like nation. So it is entirely appropriate for sovereign nations to freely choose to offer freedom of movement across their borders. Both closed and open policies are consistent with national sovereignty. The question, however, for America is, and for any country is, which of those two postures, open border or closed border, is more consistent with its own commitment to individual liberty, free markets, and limited government? Those are the core American principles. So I see the problem as, which of those two policies is consistent with those core ideals. And I would suggest to you that open borders, properly understood, is the policy that is consistent with these American ideals. Open borders does not mean that we should welcome any hoodlum or any terrorist or contagious person into the country and not ask them questions. What it does mean is that immigration policy should be based on the socio-economic needs of the country's residents, of the people who are here, not the arbitrary whims of bureaucrats or the grand designs of social planners. If you have taken an economics and studied with the Austrian professors over here, that's the first starting principle is that central planners and engineers don't do a good and rational job of organizing society. This implies that the government has a legitimate role in keeping out foreigners who pose a genuine security or public health threat. But beyond that, they should be allowed in whenever an American is willing to hire them or wants to live with them or for whatever reason. Government should not be in the business of keeping apart, for example, willing American employers from willing foreign workers. It doesn't matter whether Americans want low-skilled workers to pick fruit in their farms or high-skilled workers to develop software in their computer labs. In other words, what I'm suggesting, the proper definition of open borders is that there should be a presumption of liberty built into our immigration policies. Government should be required to justify why someone can't come into the country or why an American can't sponsor someone to come in, not the other way around. To put it in jurisprudential terms, whenever government wants to bar an American from hiring, marrying, or living with a foreigner in the US, it ought to have a strict scrutiny test. This means that it must show that it has a compelling state interest in keeping a foreigner or a class of foreigners out, and that there is no other way of accomplishing that goal except for banning this foreigner from entering the country. Now, this is actually a far, far cry from the way our current system works. The best way to understand our current system is that it effectively imposes a blanket ban on immigration, which it then arbitrarily relaxes based on predefined bureaucratic categories or some political whim of the moment. So whether it is encouraging family reunification or enhancing ethnic diversity or helping an industry that some central planner has decided is important. The obvious objection to open, actually the more accurate term for what I'm suggesting is looser borders, is that we'd be flooded with immigrants beyond our capacity to absorb them. Given that literally a quarter of the world's population wishes to move to relatively richer countries. But just as is the case with other resources, markets and prices, I would suggest to you, would regulate immigration flows far more efficiently than the government. Immigrants don't actually come here unless they can sustain themselves here. Immigration ebbs and flows with the economy, increasing during boom times when job opportunities are plentiful, and declining and even reversing during a bust when these opportunities dry up. And that's actually happened in the recent recession when, in 2008, 2007, 2008, net immigration to this country was zero. Now, this kind of idea that we let immigration flows regulate themselves sound pretty radical or utopian. In fact, America had open borders till the early 20th century. After that, actually, it was thanks to labor pressure combined with nativist anti-Catholic sentiment, actually, at that time against Irish. America imposed strict national country quotas, and this happened in the 1920s, 1930s. To a very large extent, our current problem of the 11 million undocumented workers is a direct result of all the restrictionist policies that stemmed between about 1930 to 1965. 1965, we briefly had something called the Barcero program, which was a guest worker program with Mexico, where we would hand out visas for any Mexican who wanted to come and work in the United States very quickly. And in 1965, we did away with that Barcero program. And we didn't replace it with anything else. So the demand, both on the Mexican side and the American side, remained, but we just took away that legal channel for immigration. And our current 11 million undocumented workers is a direct consequence of that. And the reason this was done was because labor unions did not like the wage competition by foreign labor. It was the unions who were opposed to it, combined with some nativist elements among sort of reactionary conservative circles, but it was mainly labor union pressure at that time that stopped the Barcero program. But before we go on to discuss the problems with our current immigration policy, and I'll get into that a little bit more later, I'll just spend some time making a positive, comprehensive case for immigration to you guys. And basically, I lay out three broad arguments for immigration based on its economic, humanitarian, and what I call liberty benefits. And I've designed it so that there is, one flavor for right-wingers, one flavor for left-wingers, and one flavor for libertarians. And libertarians actually can get into all three because they like all three arguments. So if you guys have any libertarians over here, you will have a field day. So, the economic benefits of immigration. Now the funny thing is, and here I'm probably preaching to the choir to some extent, the funny thing is that there is actually among economists an overwhelming consensus that immigration is a great blessing for both immigrants and the host country. It's a win-win. What's more, this consensus not only cuts across political lines but also methodological ones, with classical liberals, neoclassical, Chicago School, Austrian, and even some Keynesian economists all agreeing that relatively unfettered labor mobility maximizes economic growth. Adam Smith opposed mercantilist restrictions not just on capital, but on labor as well. Ludwig von Mises, the guru of the Austrian school, advocated a system of free trade where capital and labor would be employed wherever conditions were most favorable for production. The one prominent exception to these economists was, can anybody guess who that might be? Any guesses? Huh?
The Keynes?
No, Keynesians are in favor.
So that's nationalist like List?
Huh?
Nationalist like Frederick List?
He might have been too, but I don't count him as a major economist, and less of an economist than maybe a political economist. Actually, Karl Marx. Karl Marx was the great exception. Although he didn't treat the subject in any systematic way like some of the other thinkers, like von Mises actually has some very good stuff in it. His comments suggest that he was really no fan of immigration. He regarded England's decision to absorb the surplus Irishmen being driven out of their country during the Great Famine not as a benefit to England, but a ploy by the English bourgeoisie to force down wages and lower the material and moral position of the English working class. The popular modern-day restrictionist canard that immigration from the third world to rich countries is tantamount to importing poverty has its genesis actually in Marxist thought. So it is ironic that according to polls, half of the public in America, more than half, America is particularly strange because it's a land of immigrants, sides not with free market economists like von Mises and Adam Smith, but with Karl Marx, the father of socialism. Now, the primary reason for this is that the case for open borders is actually very counterintuitive. It is hard to see how in a world of finite resources, allowing more people into a country would enhance its prosperity instead of leading to overcrowding, more job competition, and lower wages. But this Malthusian worldview is actually quite wrong. At the heart of the economic debate about immigration is also a question that haunts environmental issues. Are human beings a liability who deplete resources, or an asset who themselves are a resource? Or to use the parlance of Julian Simon, the great economist. How many of you are familiar with Julian Simon? Yeah, so Julian Simons, he called human beings the ultimate resource. So advocates of open borders instinctively see human beings as something of an asset. Human ingenuity and hard work turns fallow land bounteous, dirt into valuable metals, and sand into computer chips. There is no given or fixed set of natural resources out there, Simon pointed out. Useless materials become resources when human creativity finds a way to harness them. Oil was just a toxic black liquid in the ground till humans discovered that it could be burned for light and power. The development of high-yield grains increased the productivity of land exponentially, and human population grew only arithmetically, which was the exact opposite of what Malthus would have predicted. The most important factor limiting a country's economic progress then isn't its insufficient physical resources, but its insufficient human resources. So hence, contrary to Malthusian thinking, population increases through immigration are nothing to fret over. That's because immigrants are not only mouths who need to be fed, they're also minds and hands who grow the economic pie. They certainly consume resources, but they produce far more than they consume over the long run. And to the extent that immigrants, whether high or low-skilled immigrants, have jobs, it's because they produce more wealth or value for their employers than they consume in wages. Now, everybody would regard it as colossally stupid if America dispatched missiles to shoot down foreign planes periodically airdropping free goods on American homes, right? Yet, why is it not equally foolish when it shoos away the source of this wealth, namely Mexicans, whose sweat puts cheap goods in American homes, or when it turns away Chinese computer engineers whose smarts are virtually spinning gold from sand? Economists now unanimously agree that immigrants increase native wages from upwards of like $27 billion, and there was a Cato study which actually said over 10 years, looser immigration policies would increase the GDP by $1.5 trillion. Even Harvard University's George Borjas, who's the favorite economist of restrictionists, agrees that immigrants on the whole grease the wheels of the economy because they are far more mobile than the native population, which has deep roots in a community. So they can quickly move to wherever their skills are needed, and this is especially true for Mexican farm labor. They work half the year, Michigan doesn't have too many of them, it does have few, but in cold climates, and then half the year in southern United States or in California. Not too many people outside of restrictionist circles believe that high-skilled foreigners are anything but an unmitigated economic blessing. That's because their innovations and high-tech entrepreneurship are vital in an advanced knowledge economy such as ours. They create high-paying jobs, raise native wages, and contribute more to public coffers than they consume in welfare. So nobody seriously doubts that. The real controversy is about the impact of low-skilled immigrants. But here also, the controversy is mainly in the political realm. Among economists, there is a great deal of consensus that even these immigrants are a net economic asset. And I'll give you a personal example that will actually help to illustrate some of the economic literature on this, on the benefits of low-skilled immigrants. And so I have this house in West Bloomfield, and it's got a very large yard. It's like on 1 acre land, and most of it is lawn, and we've got large flower beds and what have you. And landscaping services in Michigan are extremely expensive. And for a while, I was trying to deal with my yard, on my own, pulling weeds and what have you, and I was doing permanent damage to my back. And then, so finally I said, to my husband, I can't cope with this, we've got to get a landscaping service, but we've got to find something affordable. So we finally, after a great deal of research, we found this guy, the service, which is run by this Iraqi guy, and we'll call him Jacob. He's a Chaldean, he's been, he's not first generation immigrant, he actually came over here when he was little, and he's grew up here, but came from Iraq. And Jacob could offer us a good price. Now, why could he offer us a good price? Because he had somehow managed to get seasonal work visas for low-skilled Mexicans that in Michigan is tantamount to winning the lottery. Over a period of time, now Jacob, think about this, first of all. I grew up in India, came to the United States. So an immigrant woman hiring an immigrant Chaldean who is employing immigrant workers from Mexico to do lawn mowing and maintenance of the yard. This is actually not something that happens in too many other countries. So you just have to step back and behold that story a little bit. So this is like one part of the economy that would not exist but for immigrants, right? But anyway, over a period of time, Jacob's business has expanded from home to commercial landscaping. However, his Mexican yard workers with their meager English-speaking skills are unable to communicate with his business clients. So he has hired a cadre of native-born kids, barely out of high school, to accompany his Mexican teams on every job. These American kids don't have to do much, except that, they oversee the Mexicans and talk to the client when the need arises. And so I actually can't talk to any of the, I don't speak Spanish, so I can't really talk directly to these Mexican workers. If I need to explain something, I have to use very elaborate sign language. And my sign language is worse than my French, so yet their supervisory role of these, American barely high school graduates commands them much better wages than if they had been doing the job of those Mexicans and pulling weeds. So if Jacob couldn't hire cheap Mexican labor, it wouldn't mean that he would just pay more for American labor, as a lot of people who oppose immigration insist. It would just mean that his business would just not get off the ground, because he couldn't offer his services at a price that was affordable to people like me. So either way, there would be a net attrition in the economic activity, of the country, and there would be productivity losses. So there are three broad lessons of this story, and each one of them actually is borne out in economic literature. And I have a long paper I did for Reason Foundation one time where, it's got links and what have you. So if anybody is interested, you should check that out. So there are three broad lessons of this story. First, the most obvious one that no one disputes is that Americans like me are not competitors but customers of low-skilled immigrants. Immigrant presence therefore increases our real wages as goods and services become cheaper, allowing us to buy more with the same amount of income. And it increases our productivity by allowing us to use our time on tasks that would generate the best returns for us. So if I don't have to spend time mowing my lawn and pulling weeds, I can spend more time writing. actually, I would probably make more money pulling weeds than as a writer, but that's another story. But the second, the lesson over here is that most low-skilled immigration doesn't mean fewer jobs for the native born, because jobs are not a zero-sum game. Just like Jacob's Mexican workforce, their cheaper rates expand the market for these services. In this way, immigrants actually create jobs for Americans. They don't snatch anybody else's job. They create their own jobs, which then support other American jobs. So their presence allows more businesses to form, creating better paying jobs for Americans. Now, the only economist who has ever found a significant displacement of natives by low-skilled immigrants in America is George Borjas. He's actually Cuban by origin, and he himself is an immigrant. And that's because he assumed that there was far greater substitutability among high school or American graduates and low-skilled workers. So he assumed that they were interchangeable, that you could use either, which is not the case, because the minute you have immigrants, American high school kids, they don't want to do that job anymore because they can get something better. So they are not actually substitutable. The third lesson of my story is that not only do immigrants not cost American jobs, they don't actually threaten American wages either. And that's because their presence allows natives, such as Jacob's American supervisors, to exploit their language and their communication skills where their real competitive advantage lies. So those skills, the language speaking skills, become relatively scarcer, whereas the weed pulling skills become relatively more abundant. So they are pushed to exploit their wage skills, which are valued higher in the market. So their wages actually go up because of immigrants. Now, restrictionists argue that the laws of supply and demand dictate that as the supply of immigrant labor increases, overall wages should decrease. And again, the best evidence for this claim comes from Borjas himself. He disaggregated the impact of low-skilled immigration on different native groups in a paper that was gloomily titled, "The Labor Demand Curve is Downward Sloping." And he found a net overall negative impact on American wages as well as on every cohort of American. I mean, so it was high-skilled people also lose, everybody loses. But that was actually only in the short run. His own paper showed that the overall impact over the long run was zero. Only one group, he said, high school dropouts, felt any noticeable and long-lasting negative impact. They experienced a wage loss of 5%, he said. That is native high school dropouts. But there's subsequent studies by Giovanni Perri and Ottaviano using Borjas' own data could not corroborate his finding. And not even so, in other words, not even high school dropouts experience a wage loss, according to them. And essentially they discovered two reasons for why their finding differed from Borjas' finding. One, they said, as we discussed, Borjas overestimated the substitutability of immigrants and native-born without high school degrees. And so he didn't take into account fully the comparative advantage that native skills gain in the wake of greater immigration. But more crucially, Borjas made the Malthusian assumption that capital wouldn't adjust in response to the greater availability of immigrant labor. So in other words, his model essentially took the existing amount of capital and divided it among a greater number of workers, and presto, you get lower wages. But that's not exactly how the real world works, that's not how the economy works. If it did work that way, every new generation would pose a problem to the workers who were already in an economy. Our children would become threatening to us because they would threaten our wages, right? And so that's not how the economy works. So open immigration policies are a win for immigrants who can escape poverty and improve their lives, a win for native consumers of immigrant services whose real wages increase as their cost of goods and services decreases, and a win for native workers who experience productivity gains as their comparative advantage shifts. But let me consider one powerful objection that opponents of immigration make against relaxing our borders. They say whatever the economic case for open policies in theory, such policies are simply not compatible with the existence of a welfare state. That's because the welfare state, they say, privatizes the benefits of immigrants to the employers who grab the surplus value, but it socializes the cost to American taxpayers who end up paying for the healthcare and schooling, etc. of immigrants. So we can get more into this in the question and answer session, but just let me suggest it to you as bluntly as I can that this is a complete red herring. Now, no one disputes that high-skilled immigrants are a huge boon for the welfare state because they pay more in taxes than they consume in benefits. The richest income groups in this country right now are actually Chinese and Indians and Jewish people. Native-born, non-Hispanic, whites are the next, and then Hispanics are at the, more than blacks, but less than non-Hispanic whites. So the richest people in this country are high-skilled immigrants. So nobody disputes that. That's kind of like settled. But even low-skilled immigrants actually strengthen the welfare state, and there are many reasons for this, and I can't even go into all of them over here, but let me give you the big one, which is that they come to this country during their peak years of productivity after another society has borne the cost of raising them. So we get a generational windfall when a whole generation of immigrants comes and contributes to our economy in whom we have made no investment whatsoever. Children are a very, very expensive way to keep your population on par, because children, for 18 years of their lives, they are net consumers, or parasitic in a way. They are not contributing anything. Somebody is paying for their upkeep. And so children is in some ways the most expensive way of keeping your population levels at a maintainable level. So the other thing is, bear in mind that when we are talking about the welfare costs of immigrants, we are essentially talking about two things. We are talking about the cost of educating their children and their own emergency care, health care, because everything else they are actually legally barred from collecting. Since 1996, there was big welfare reform in this country, and all federal means-tested benefits were denied to immigrants. So even if you are here in this country legally, you cannot collect food stamps, you cannot collect all kinds of benefits that native-born do. Now, so setting aside the cost of the cost of emergency care, most middle-class American families with more than 3 school-age children would actually impose a net fiscal burden. If you take a certain snapshot in time and you compare native-born families with 3 children with native-born families immigrant families with 3 children, they would all be a net drain on the welfare state. And in fact, the native-born would be a greater drain because they are entitled to far more benefits, and every study shows that their rate of usage of welfare is much greater. They collect more welfare, and they at higher rates. So the only thing that we are talking about is actually education in the welfare that we are talking about is education, and most people do not think about education as welfare. They regard it as an investment that pays dividends, even when it's delivered through inefficient public schools. So if you think about it, there's really not a lot of there to this argument that immigrants are a next net drain on the welfare state. But whatever the fiscal cost, small fiscal costs of immigrants, they still don't negate the economic contributions that these low-skilled immigrants make. There are plenty of solid state-level studies that testify to this. For example, a comprehensive analysis that was done in Texas found that if you take away illegal immigrants, it would save the Treasury $504 million annually, because they consume $504 million more in welfare, which is schools and what have you, than they pay in taxes. But without them, the labor market would have tightened, diminishing the competitive edge of Texas businesses, causing the state's economy to shrink by 2.1% or $17.7 billion. And so restrictionists, like to emphasize the welfare costs of immigration, but what they never say is that their own preferred policy positions are not costless. They do impose a cost on the economy, and a very heavy one. And a Cato Institute actually did a study, said that, if you kick out all the undocumented workers who are in the country, the US economy will shrink by $2.6 trillion over 10 years. So 1.5 trillion gain over 10 years versus 2.6 trillion loss over 10 years, that works out to close to a $5 trillion loss for the economy. And this is something that never gets factored into discussions about immigration. So that's kind of the economic case for immigration. So let's move on to the humanitarian case for immigration. This is, the argument that ought to appeal to liberals, and it's not just conservatives who are opposed to immigration. I mean, liberals are also, historically, they've been opposed to immigration partly because of labor pressure, but partly for all kinds of other reasons. So, America spends both its foreign policy, and its aid policy have a humanitarian component. America's overseas foreign policies have been, they've been targeted towards liberating people from tyranny and, getting rid of poverty. And I am going to argue that actually immigration is a more rational way of achieving both. Through liberating people from tyranny as well as alleviating poverty in the world. Liberating the oppressed has been at least part of the rationale why we've gone into every major war in recent times, whether it's World War I, whether it's World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Balkans, Iraq, and now Libya. All of them we've said we want to eradicate tyranny. That's the major rationale we've given. In Iraq especially, removing the boot of Saddam Hussein from the neck of the Iraqi people was an explicit and even primary justification for the war. In this war, the US lost 4,000 soldiers, and when all was said and done, the cost to US taxpayers is expected to exceed $1 trillion of the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars combined. But if liberating people from tyranny is such an important goal, then instead of sending American guns and soldiers to other lands, we should be giving them visas to come to ours. So if you take East Germany, what caused the communist dictatorship to eventually collapse was not a military offensive by the West. It was the fall of the Berlin Wall, something that allowed East Germans to emigrate en masse to West Germany. And why did this bring down the fall of communism and the collapse of the Berlin Wall? Because communist tyrants could not get a steady supply of victims. All their victims had left. When they started leaving and they had an exit option, that's when, communist rulers decided that they needed to reform themselves, that they could not hang on to their population and their people without allowing a little more freedom. So that's when the torture chambers started closing. That's when the whole Stasi operation evaporated, was after Berlin Wall allowed Eastern Germans to move over to Berlin. So giving people an exit strategy is actually the best way of undermining tyranny, and it is much, much, much cheaper to America in terms of blood and treasure than waging war, obviously. Incidentally, the number of Iraqis that we allowed into the country in the first 8 years after the war, I mean, we displaced about 2 million people, and at least in the first 6 or 7 years after the war, we had allowed only 8,000 people to come into this country. And a lot of them, I mean, what was shocking about it was a lot of these people had actually helped us against Al-Qaeda and, whatnot, and the local, helped us in our war effort against local Baathists, and then we just left them there. We abandoned them to, be tyrannized and persecuted by local authorities. But just as American guns are not the most effective way to help people living under tyranny, American aid is not the most effective means for helping people live under poverty. Every year, the American government hands out about $28 billion in taxpayer money to third world countries to fight poverty. But we all know where this aid goes. It goes directly into the pockets of their kleptocratic rulers and their supporters. Very, very little actually reaches its intended beneficiaries. By contrast, a more generous program of work visas would cost the US government nothing. It would actually improve our economy, and it would make an instant difference to the lives of visa recipients. A colleague of mine, Carrie Howley, who's now actually a very celebrated writer, she actually had a very beautiful quote, and she said this: "There is no development policy, no feasible amount of foreign aid, no poundage of fair trade coffee that will help someone from a developing country to a better life more than opening the door to a better economy, instantly doubling or tripling the value of their labor." A Mexican worker for the identical work will, they step across this arbitrary border on a map and they will increase their wages instantly by 4 or 5 times. So there is nothing that helps the cause of alleviating poverty more than simply hopping over, which is why there's a great incentive for people to hop over. So immigration is the best anti-poverty program. So that ought to, be something for liberals. So now the libertarian case for open borders, the liberty benefits of open borders. That open immigration, we know that it helps the economy, we know all of that. It's, the Statue of Liberty and all of that, they're all good reasons for supporting immigration. But here is the thing. The best reason is that we want to maintain a free society. That's the best reason to have open policies. You have all heard of F.A. Hayek? If you have not, then you need to just return your degree and get your money back and leave. And you can't be in Hillsdale and not have heard of Frederick Hayek, right? So Frederick Hayek, he became, famous initially not for his, law, legislation, and liberty, not for Constitution of Liberty, not for his work in economics that got him the Nobel Prize and business bus cycle and all of that. He became most famous for writing a book called The Road to Serfdom. You've all heard of it? Okay. What was his argument in The Road to Serfdom? His argument was that when the government interferes with the peaceful, voluntary activities of individuals to achieve some collectivist end, it inevitably puts the country on the road to serfdom. And he said it doesn't matter whether the ends are socialistic ones, such as equality through income redistribution, which is, he was addressing the socialists of his time, so that was one end, or conservatives ones, such as cultural preservation by restricting trade and immigration. His point was you try and restrict the activities of individuals and you will be on the road to serfdom. And why? He said, because these restrictions will leave individuals substantially worse off, and they will try and find a way to circumvent these restrictions. And that will unleash all kinds of unintended consequences. But the government's failure to achieve its ends will not be perceived as evidence that there is something wrong with these ends, that perhaps they are not in sync with the normal aspirations of people. Rather, the failure will be blamed on the insufficient use of force in achieving the ends that are otherwise good and noble. That's what the government will think. And thus, an initial round of coercion will inevitably spawn ever more draconian rounds of coercion, putting the country on the road to serfdom. This is the logic that is kind of playing out in the war of drugs, and this is also the logic that is, in my views, unfolding on the war on immigration. Consider now, so we'll get back into how American immigration policy really works. Consider how American employers are treated by our immigration system. The government caps the number of highly skilled foreign workers that high-tech companies can hire to around 85,000 a year. It's called the H-1B visa program. This quota of 85,000 is filled within the first 5 days of its opening every year. Within the first week is filled. Companies then have to wait another year to play the visa lottery again. I mean, the demand is kind of like, I think it's like 300,000 or 400,000, something enormous, and we give out 85,000 visas. But bad as highly skilled immigrants are treated, this is nothing compared to the plight of American farmer, landscape companies, crab pickers, construction companies that rely on so-called unskilled workers, which, by the way, this whole skilled, unskilled distinction, in my view, is completely arbitrary. It's a bureaucratic distinction. I mean, for employers, they are workers who help them make money, and there are workers who don't help them make money. It doesn't, they don't really care about skilled, and I mean, that's not how they sit and think about, hiring when they think of it. These are essentially bureaucratic categories. But if high-skilled immigrants are treated poorly and they have to jump through all these hoops and red tape and what have you, low-skilled immigrants receive what I call the equivalent of waterboarding treatment by a bureaucracy. There are no visas for many of their categories, and the caps on some of the others are so severe that getting a visa is like winning a lottery. What's more, that the hoops that these workers and employers have to jump through are so onerous and time-consuming that for all practical purposes, these visas may as well not exist. To give you one example, H2A category, which is for agricultural workers. To get an agricultural visa, a poor Mexican worker who applies in Mexico has to show to the immigration officer that he has a land and job and property to come back to after his job over here is over. Now, if he had all those things, why would he be coming here in the first place? So they create like this catch-22 in our, because they simply don't want these people here for all kinds of reasons. And, and so, yeah, we've got to, so you'll hear people say rule of law and what have you, but the rule of law has been deliberately constructed so as not to function. And so, these people apply for visas and they're not going to get them because there's just no way they can meet the requirements of the visa. So for all practical purposes, these visas simply don't work and they don't exist. So the options for these employers is to basically follow the law. I mean, American employers who want to like Jacob, they can follow the law and not get their workers and go out of business, or they can ignore the law and they can stay in business. Similarly, workers can wait for a visa and starve, or they can forget about the visa and feed them, come over here illegally and feed themselves. I mean, that's the choice. These are, for a lot of these workers, these are life and death choices. So is it any surprise that many of these people are coming illegally so that they can live? It is not. But instead of relaxing, and this is like Hayek's road to serfdom argument in action over here, but instead of relaxing America's immigration laws in the face of widespread non-compliance, what are our lawmakers doing? They are redoubling their efforts to enforce these laws exactly as Hayek would have predicted. So far from easing these restrictions, now the government has approved in this latest DHS spending bill billions of dollars to create a double fence on the Mexican border. So they want to create the Great Wall of China on the Rio Grande. And they are going to have more troops, they are going to have more drones, they are going to have more surveillance cameras to police, this border. But that's only the beginning. They're also, what they want to do is crack down on employers, or interior enforcement is what they call it, who hire, because there's a demand over here. You can't stop people from coming till you do something about the demand side of things too. So there is a serious effort afoot right now in Congress to force employers to join something called the E-Verify program. How many of you have heard of E-Verify? Yeah, E-Verify program that would require these employers to check the work eligibility of all their workers, immigrants and citizens, against a federal database. Now this sounds innocuous, but think about it. The net effect of such a law would be to require all Americans to essentially get a permission slip from their government in order to work before they can work. Instead of the government having to prove that the workers is ineligible for employment, which is what presumption of liberty would require the government to do, workers, including Americans, have to prove that they are eligible to work. Indeed, as somebody put it, we are all illegals now. There is also something called actually the CARRY program, which I've written about. It's a pilot program in New Orleans where essentially local law enforcement officials join forces with immigration and custom enforcement people, and they would go in unmarked vans, in plain clothes. ICE officials would go and park themselves outside of Latino, Hispanic neighborhoods in New Orleans. And anybody coming and going, they would just stop them and question them without probable cause and ask them about their, status, whether they were in the country legally or illegally. And regardless of what the person said, they would take them, detain them in this van where they would have a fingerprinting unit. And they would fingerprint this person and make them wait over there till they had checked their fingerprint against a federal database. And then if they came out clear, it was fine. Otherwise, they were taken into deportation facilities. Now, 70% of the people that they were catching were here either legally or they were American citizens. So they were detaining American citizens without probable cause just because they wanted to check their status. And a lot of the Latino families are mixed status families, meaning that some people are legal and some people are not legal. So, you had husband, and so the husband might be legal and the wife might not be legal, or the children are, American citizens because they were born here, but one of the parents is not. So, Latino communities in New Orleans were living in absolute terror of these, what they were calling these ICE raids, arbitrarily. And the federal government is not alone in running roughshod over the liberties of Americans to smoke out illegals. Many cities such as Riverside, New Jersey are jumping in on the action. They have banned landlords from renting or selling property to illegals. If government can bar private homeowners from renting to illegals, then why can't it search their homes to ensure that they are not secretly harboring illegals? I mean, that's the next step, right? Why can't it monitor their bank accounts for suspicious activity? You are paying illegals, right? So why not go into your bank account? Congress has actually considered a bill that would have prosecuted churches and soup kitchens that offered free meals to illegals on the ground that they were aiding and abetting an illegal act. Arizona and Alabama Republicans are imposing something called the business death penalties that revoke the license of any employer who's caught twice with an illegal in his employ. In other words, these states are shutting down American businesses to protect American jobs. I mean, how, nutty is that? Immigrants are so intimately enmeshed in the American workplace and communities that government actually can't surgically excise these illegals while leaving everyone else unscathed. That's not how it works. Behind every illegal is an American who is benefiting. Immigrants and citizens alike are, their rights are therefore inextricably linked, and the government has to either respect everyone's rights or no one's rights. Liberty is not a divisible thing, folks. Everybody has it, or, everybody doesn't. So a crackdown on immigrants to be truly effective can't but help swallow our Bill of Rights. We will all be in collateral damage in this war on immigrants. That ultimately is a reason to have open policies.
We have about 10 minutes for questions if anyone has any.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's sort of an uphill battle politically and even in the court of public opinion to try to advance these ideas.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, and you mentioned it's sort of reminiscent of the war on drugs, where
Yeah.
it's not politically expedient to say, I'm going to be looser on drug policy, and it's certainly not, with opening borders. So what do you think has to happen to sort of maybe convince the American people or politicians, or sort of what gives?
It is, I've been covering this issue for a long time, like 20 years now, and I've actually never seen the conversation worse than it is right now. Immigration is always a difficult issue for the reason that I described initially in the talk. For most people, what's intuitive is certain Malthusianism, right? Finite things, and how do you let more people in? And, so it's very hard to convince people that, you can have more people and you will be richer. So the politicians play on that sentiment, because partly it's in, labor unions, for instance, it's always been in their vested interest to not allow more immigrants. And conservatives, even though they sometimes get the economic argument, but they are so afraid of the cultural impact of immigration that they forget that they have a commitment to limited government too, and they have a commitment to liberty too, which is more fundamental. And so, it's just a very, very difficult conversation to win. And right now, unfortunately, because of new media and technologies where, Rush Limbaugh, commands, he's very persuasive and he's quite loud, and I actually like him, and he's quoted my articles on his show a number of times because there are issues on which I agree with him, right? But on this issue, he will not allow any political solution to the undocumented workers to go forward. Until you solve the undocumented worker problem, Democrats will not let immigration reform on anything else to happen. So you have like this complete logjam where the Republicans won't let, quote unquote, amnesty, and Democrats won't talk till Republicans do something. So it's at a complete standstill. So it's a very difficult issue. So I really think that the only way, this whole issue will get solved in some ways is, what Obama has done, which is through executive action, that take this off the table, take the whole problem of illegal immigration off the table. In 5 years, people's nerves will calm down, and then we can talk about something going forward, creating a guest worker program with Mexico, which even labor unions have agreed that we need now. Grudgingly, but they have. So you've got to take just this one issue off the table, and then you can, yeah.
So do you think some sort of amnesty precedes the need for other reform? I guess.
It shouldn't really. They should be able to do all this piecemeal, right? So forget about. I do feel bad for the 11 million undocumented people. You are not going to deport them, right? And it makes much more sense for the country to, if you don't want to, amnesty historically and traditionally has meant citizenship, and that is completely off the table. Citizenship is not on the cards right now. But now the whole definition of amnesty has been, inflated, so no, any form of legalization, just giving them a work permit is now regarded as amnesty. And, at this stage, given how poisoned the political conversation is, I'm in favor of tabling the amnesty issue and let these people be, let them just stay the way they are staying, but reform everything else so that you're at least not continuously feeding their numbers, right? So let them be, but create a guest worker program with Mexico and fix the legal immigration system, the high-skilled immigration, system, which everybody agrees needs to be fixed. Move on those fronts, and slowly this issue goes away. Problem is, right now, it's very much in the interest, and I hate to say this, but it's very much in the interest of Republicans to keep the amnesty issue alive because it helps them win elections.
Yeah, so I guess, one other question. How important do you think economic reform is as far as specifically minimum wage laws, were legal workers to start coming in, and just the mobility of work throughout the economy? Like how important? Because obviously a lot of the jobs that would be being done would probably be worth, the wages would be less than minimum wage. Do you think that there needs to be economic reform that would accompany this sort of labor reform?
So that's a very good question, and one of the attractions of illegal immigration to some extent is that you don't have to pay them minimum wage, right? And so you reform minimum wage where it becomes legal to pay native workers, below the minimum wage, and they suddenly become competitive again for those kinds of jobs with illegals. The thing is, that's in theory, it's a problem, but the fact of the matter is that there aren't very many Americans who will work those jobs at any price, right? Because Americans can get welfare, which is something that immigrants don't get. So if they can stay at home and collect a welfare check, regardless of what the minimum wage is or isn't, their incentive to work is a little bit less. So, so I think, if you're going to fix anything, with the broader, economy, I think you've got to tackle the welfare state, really. Although I'm no fan of minimum wages, and I think they ought to go for all kinds of reasons, but I'm not sure in this case it really matters that much.
Yeah, I have, first of all, let me clarify, I completely agree with you.
Oh, good.
I didn't know.
Have I won you over, or were you?
I was already.
Oh, okay.
But, there was one point on which there might be a room for possible pushback on a leftist perspective.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about how the labor market views people, or letting people make their own decisions in the labor market on immigration sort of implies a more humanitarian aspect, because it gives them this position of freedom. From certain leftist perspectives, I'm not sure that that's how they would view it. And part of this speaks to why Marx might have been against immigration, insofar as they would view the labor market as somehow commodifying humans or
Yeah,
depreciating their
right.
value. Michael Sandel has this whole book on the moral limits of markets, where
Yeah,
he says
right.
market limits are
Right,
encroaching
right.
into how we understand social relationships. And so I'm not sure he would make that distinct or that argument in this context, but certainly Marx would. And that lends us to the question of how do we respond to that point?
Well, I mean, that's why I have like this whole slew of arguments. So maybe all the
Yeah.
economic arguments may not appeal to them. I fully, understand that. And historically, actually, you had more pushback on, open borders or, more generous immigration policies from the left than from the right. I mean, it's only very recently that Democrats have become such fans of immigration reform because the labor unions have had a change of heart. And the reason labor unions have had a change of heart is that in America, their union membership is declining. And they see immigrant workers as going into industries that they can still unionize. So service industries like hotels, the Service Employees International Union, they want more Mexicans over there because they can unionize them. So yeah, I mean, you're right. I think this whole, Marxist and liberals won't like the economic arguments that I am making. I'm not sure they would buy them. Neoclassical economists would. They basically do.
And to respond to my own point, Jason Brennan does have of Georgetown University, has a forthcoming book really pushing back against Sandel's claims that markets are inherently commodifying people.
Yeah,
So there are arguments out there to the contrary of what I just said, but
Right.
they're still worth taking seriously.
right.
So would you advocate any kind of border at all?
I think for borders for purposes of preventing a foreign army from coming into your country and invading you, you need a border there. You've got to have like a border in that sense that we are going to defend if, if Iran decides it's going to throw a nuclear missile into LA, well, you do need borders for that. I'm just talking for very, very limited, like the flow of people. That's where borders are kind of like a meaningless thing.
Okay, because like the 9/11 Commission report, 20, I think, documented terrorists came through on visas,
Mm-hmm.
and they overstayed those visas and were the terrorists that
Right.
committed those acts.
Yeah.
So I don't understand how national security is an issue with this.
No, I'm not saying it's not an issue. I'm saying it is an issue. And what I am saying is that you do have to vet, people who want to come in for security reasons, as for health reasons, which is what we used to do in this country till, 1920, 1930. People would show up on Ellis Island or wherever, they would do a health, they would give them a thorough physical exam, and they would ask them, about their criminal history and, what have you. Now, I'm sure some people lied about it, but they had mechanisms in place at that time to vet for these threats. I mean, the problem is right now, we are preventing so many economic immigrants to come in that we are spending all our resources stopping these people who all they want to do is come and work and, feed their families. We are expending so many resources preventing these people from coming in that we are actually not looking for people like the 9/11 terrorists and giving them a thorough background check before they want to enter.
So wouldn't that also entail some kind of tracking system?
No, it would. I mean, I'm not, so, when I say, if you practically start thinking through the implications of what I'm saying, in some ways, not a hell of a lot is going to change, right? People will still have to show, so if anybody goes to the American consulate in Mexico and says, I want to come over here, the visa officer would still have to say, well, they'll still have to vet their application, right? Except that the questions that they would ask them will be not, are you going to return to Mexico? It will be, well, show me your criminal background.
Right, I mean on the
So-
American side, like with the American employers, like doesn't that also require that the American employers are required to provide proof that their workers are still in touch with them and haven't been left undocumented and are just now in the country?
That's a requirement now?
They have to provide, they have to keep records and provide.
Well, right, yeah, right. But I don't think that's necessary or required because you do the background check when the person enters. I mean, look, you can't stop every bad, you can't stop everybody from going bad. I mean, you can't stop that with the native born, right? I mean, you do have Timothy McVeighs in this world. So unless there is some real odds that immigrants are going to be somehow worse than your native born, why would you keep special tabs on them? I mean, the tabs have to be kept at the point of when they enter to vet for their existing history, not what they might do in 30 years or what their children might do or what their grandchildren might do. I mean, you can never have that kind of knowledge or information, right? So, I'm in favor of checking, these people's history when they enter, but after that, I think they should be free to go wherever they want to, not be tethered to an employer, and prosecute them when they do something, just as you treat the native born.
Okay, so one more question following that line. As far as the drug problem goes, like the violence along the border with drug cartels, how would you address that? Because most of the concern along the border with illegal immigration is the violence that comes across it because of that. So would you recommend increasing that?
No, I would say call off the war on drugs.
Just let drugs come freely across and all the violence?
But they still do. They're still coming. It's just that now they're coming in through criminals whom you cannot, monitor in any way, shape, or form. I mean, depends how far you want to go with this, right? I mean, look, you stop drugs on the border, right? And you have meth labs. I mean, there was a whole television series, if I recall, Breaking Bad made on. And if there is a demand over here, somebody is going to fill it. So you might get internal criminal networks or you might get external ones. When you, launch a war on drugs, which is, meant to stop the flow of drugs at the border, that becomes the criminal node, right? You try and stop it in the country and you will have criminal nodes within the country. I mean, if there is a demand for it, and this is a victimless crime in the sense that, murder, somebody gets hurt and there are 5 people who want to enforce that crime because somebody has got hurt. But in drugs or in immigration, where they are willing partners, it's a victimless crime, you can't have a proper enforcement mechanism because it serves nobody interest to help you with enforcement. So you will get a criminal, some kind of a criminal node developed somewhere if you try and come in the way of the peaceful activity of people, which isn't hurting anybody else. Yeah.
Do you think there would be a global impact in a country besides the United States demand for immigration, such as we do? Do you think that would have global impacts on other economies?
Yeah, I mean, so here's the thing. There's whole fear that, 25% of the world's population will land in the United States, and there are 6 billion people over there, which means something like 1 billion people, more than 1 billion, 2 billion people will come to the United States. It's not going to happen. And the reason it's not going to happen is because, what drives people to come to, cross borders is basically economic reason. It's a wage differential. So, with Puerto Rico, America has open borders, right? Complete open borders with Puerto Rico. What do you think the net immigration flow is? 0. It's 0. We have an open border with Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans are not coming over here. And you know why? Because their wages are now within 35% of America's wages. And that's what, economic studies have shown. When they're still poorer than us, but they're not that much poorer that they have enough of an incentive to uproot themselves, leave their families, and what have you, and come over here. So, if America opens its borders, it's, there would be the wage differential will go down, and it will help some countries and some people, and it will make some impact on poverty just by that. But the bigger impact will be that just because people from these countries can leave, it will trigger reform movements in these countries. I mean, in India, which is where I come from, in my generation, every educated person wanted to come to the United States. I mean, for us, if we got a US visa, we would buy a one-way ticket from India to America and not go back. That's already not happening. People come over here for a little while, they work over here, and then they want to return. And very often people, it's actually now, the future problem for America is not going to be too many immigrants, it's going to be too few immigrants. So in some ways, we are actually fighting the lost war by stopping immigration, because in about 20 years, we are going to have an opposite problem. And the reason this flow has reversed is not because actually India has become a whole lot richer, because it has a little bit, but not a whole lot. It's because when when people saw this sort of brain drain, this exit of talent, they said, wait a minute, we've got to do something. We've got to reform, we've got to liberalize. So, in the 90s, India underwent like this massive wave of liberalization, of its economy. And one of the reasons, not the only reasons, but one factor was this constant exodus of talent from the country. So in that sense, I think, America opening border will, help the global economy.
All right, I think it's all the time we have for questions, so once again, thank you so much.